Before we're going to turn it over to Ben. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to the Education Policy Seminar today. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us via our live stream today. Welcome to all the teachers and administrators from across the Commonwealth of the University of Virginia. The talk today is part of the Education Policy Seminar series sponsored by the Bankert Fund. Each semester we host a number of talks. Our next talk is going to be Monday, April 14th, where Eric Bettinger from Stanford Graduate School of Education is going to be joining us to discuss a topic actually similar to what Ben will be talking about today, related to higher education. For more information on Ed Policy Works, please check out our website. For today's talk, Ben Castleman will speak for about an hour and 15 minutes. And for those in the room, he's able to take questions as he goes. For those watching on the live stream, or for anyone who has questions following the talk, you're welcome to email Ben after that talk. The talk is going to promptly end at 1:45 today, but everyone is welcome to follow up via email. To do the introductions for Ben, I welcome Sarah Turner, who is the chair of the Economics Department and Associate Director of the Center.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm pleased to be here, pleased to welcome everyone who's here. I guess we all share the feature of having a lunch seminar without lunch provided. But if we were over in Baton, I'm sure they'd provide lots of food. In any event, it is my pleasure to welcome Ben Castleman. Ben is an assistant professor of education and public policy here at the University of Virginia. I've known Ben since he was a doctoral student at Harvard, where he worked with Bridget Terry Long, who is really a leader in doing work on access in higher education policy. So Ben comes to us well-trained and with a range of exposure from that environment. He's a recipient of the Spencer Foundation National Academy of Education Dissertation Fellowship, a Jack Kent Cooke Fellowship, and he's now moved on to gather awards from the Lumina Foundation, the Patricia Cross Future Leaders Award, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and the list is going to get longer as we go on. So Ben's work is actually very closely aligned with mine. He's very interested in looking at policies that contribute to the access and success of low-income students and really thinking hard about how do we know if various outreach strategies work using a set of randomized control trials to test the efficacy of some new technology-motivated interventions. Ben's only been here, I think, what, 8 months now, something like that? 6. But he's fitting in well. He seems to actually know more people at the university than I do these days. In any event, let's welcome Ben Castleman. And
well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for being here, and of course, thanks very much for the people who are taking time out of their day to watch online. I'm really excited to be able to give today's talk. I'm going to be focusing on several low-cost and easily scaled interventions that apply behavioral insights to improve post-secondary outcomes for students. I want to thank the generous funding I received from various sources: the Gates, W.T. Grant, Spencer, Heckscher Foundations, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, Abel, Dell, and Kresge Foundation. None of this work would be possible without their generous support, but any errors are solely mine and not theirs. So I started thinking about behavioral economics generally and how it could be applied to post-secondary education, not after reading a textbook or going to a lecture or reading about a journal article, but because of my children. This is Lila, and this is Simon, and they, like just about every other kid in the country, love toys, and they love the idea of toy stores. So we live in Charlottesville now. We spend a lot of time on the downtown mall, and there's several toy stores there, at least 2 actually, and it's like there's this magnetic pull. We are walking to get to a restaurant, to the children's museum, to the trolley, and as soon as they cross in front of the toy store, it's like they're inexorably pulled inside. And most of the time we force them to keep walking and break that hold, but every once in a while we'll go in with them. And they're both really into action figures, so they get in the door and they run to a shelf like this. And they get really excited. My son literally bounces when he's excited. He's still at that age. And they stare at these figures and they pick them up, but then this goes on for hours, or would go on for hours if we let them. Faced with so many choices about what toy figurine to get, they can't make any choice at all. And when they do make a choice, it's usually something that looks like a toy they already have at home, but they have some familiarity with. So of course, it's not just young children, but really students and families who face complicated information, complex choices and processes throughout their educational trajectories, and certainly in the process of choosing whether and where to go to college and then how to be successful. So that starts from the very point that students are choosing which colleges to explore or to apply to. This is just a screenshot from the College Navigator, the Department of Education's college search tool. And this is for one college. You can see that if a student wanted to learn about this institution, there'd be some information at the top. And then each of these is a drop-down menu. If a student opened all of these up, there would be hundreds of data points for the student to consider about this one institution, let alone considering across all of them. Once they've applied, students then, if they're from low or moderate income families, can apply for substantial grant and loan assistance from both the federal government, but also often completing this application qualifies them for state or institutional aid. But filling out the federal financial aid application is a very complex process. It requires a lot of income and asset information that can be quite difficult for students to complete, and that a lot of research has shown may prevent students who are academically ready from going to college, to go to college from actually entering it in the first place. And finally, as some of you probably can relate to at the beginning of each semester, once they're there, students have to choose what courses to take every semester. And particularly for students who are just starting college, this involves looking through a course catalog that may have hundreds, if not thousands of options to choose what courses to take, and beyond what to take within a given semester, understanding how different courses stitch together to lead students to a major. I want to reiterate something Jim said. Please jump in at any point with questions of any nature. If you have a question that doesn't occur to you, ask in the session. I'd be more than happy to meet or email with any of you. So please do jump in. So there are various indicators that students struggle with these types of decisions. About 2 out of every 5 low-income students doesn't apply to or attend the quality of college or university that they have the credentials to get into, the academic credentials to enter. About 1 in 5 students who graduates high school having been accepted to college, applied for financial aid, and chosen where to go as at the end of high school doesn't enroll anywhere in the year following high school. I'll return more to this work in a bit. And of students who go into college planning to pursue a major in science, technology, engineering, or math, 3 out of 5 don't persist and earn a degree in those fields. And that's closer to 75% for underrepresented students in college.
So to what extent mismatch of preferences versus persistence affect given qualifications you see?
Yeah, my sense is that that hasn't been well separated. So I would point it out as kind of a high-level indication that there may be a combination of students mismatching in their preference or just not finishing at all. So in thinking about how to help students navigate these decisions, I think it's useful to step back and consider how people in general, what are some common responses of people in general when faced with complex information, complex processes. So one common response is just to procrastinate. This is something, given their stage of cognitive development, that adolescents are particularly prone to put off onerous or complex tasks in favor of more pleasurable pursuits. But it's also something that adults are by no means immune from. I imagine, I won't ask people for a show of hands, but I would bet I'm not the only one here who has yet to hit the submit button on the 2013 taxes. Another common response is to use a simplifying strategy to make a decision. So I think one way that this shows up a lot is in the process of choosing which colleges to apply to or which colleges to attend. given all of the dimensions that we would ideally like students to consider when choosing which colleges to go to, their probability of graduating, the quality of instruction, how much advising is available, those are really complicated and often intangible dimensions for a student to evaluate about one school, let alone compare across many. And so what I think we often hear anecdotally is that students rely on more tangible factors to guide their decision making. Something like the quality of the dorm room, whether they felt a connection with their guide if they went on a campus tour. This, by the way, is an actual dorm room in a college. My dorm room looked nothing like this. Maybe I would have been more likely to go to this school. And another common response is to follow the crowd. Now, this is something that I observed a lot when I was a residential advisor at Harvard, where, like UVA, you would think people were really kind of thoughtful and strategic and contemplative about what courses to take. In a lot of the conversations I had, particularly with college freshmen about courses, students didn't know how to go about choosing the combination of English and history and Sanskrit and Near Eastern study courses to take. And so a lot of the conversations would revolve around, well, I heard a friend talking about, and at Harvard it was usually a course, every couple of years there was a course that would go viral. This was called the Science of Cooking. And this was just a course 1 year, a couple of professors put together, and hundreds of students flocked to it, despite having no interest in cooking or science. But they heard their friends had liked it, and so that was a course they were going to check out. So that's just a few, I think, of the common responses to be cognizant of when people are faced with complexity. Now, recognizing those common responses, researchers and policymakers have developed a pretty broad array of strategies to help students through these kinds of, and to help people through these kinds of complicated decisions. One approach is to simplify information that people have about the choices that are available to them. And researchers have found that simplifying information, more proactively bringing information to people, can impact a range of outcomes, from whether they participate in retirement programs, choose high-quality middle or high schools, and great work by Sarah and her colleague, Caroline Hawksby, attend well-matched colleges and universities where they're positioned for better success. Another strategy has been to reduce hassles with bureaucratic processes. A great example of this is work by my advisor, Bridget Terry Long, Eric Bettinger, who will be here in a few weeks, where they integrated the federal financial aid application process into the tax return process. So H&R Block tax professionals would spend 8 minutes helping people complete their financial aid application as part of doing their taxes anyways. That 8 minutes led to about a 33% increase in both FAFSA completion and eventual college going. Another strategy that researchers have used is just to shift people's perceptions of what the social norms are around common practices. So telling people that most people pay their taxes, or giving people a little green smiley face if they use less home energy than their neighbors, or a red frowny face if they use more home energy than their neighbors, leads to pretty substantial changes in people's behaviors around tax compliance and around energy use. And finally, this is work that I'm going to really build on. The simple act of sending people prompts and reminders helps them follow through on tasks that they want to complete, or that we think may be in their best interest. So sending people simple text messages increases their contribution to financial savings accounts, whether they get flu vaccines, whether they put on sunscreen and the like. And I'm not going to have a chance to talk about it, but I do encourage any of you to talk with Ignacio from the economics department here, who's done really interesting work looking at the effect of sending people in college information about their performance, and looking at how whether that's framed positively or negatively affects the way they engage in subsequent assessments. So really interesting work there. My first foray into this field of applying behavioral insights to improve post-secondary outcomes was in the context of the summer after high school graduation. So this is a problem that I alluded to earlier that my colleagues and I spent a lot of time looking at. And the problem is this, that you have students who've taken several steps towards going to college and gaining acceptance. They've applied, they've been accepted, they've received financial aid, they've even chosen where to go as of the end of high school. But despite both these concrete actions and these fairly clear and strong intentions, a substantial share of these students don't matriculate anywhere in the year following high This map shows data from several districts around the country that my colleagues and I have assembled about the extent of summer melt, this tendency of students who intend to and have taken actions to enroll who don't actually matriculate. It's worth pointing out that the definition of college intending varies a bit across some of these sites. In a place like Boston or Fulton County, it's a very quite strong intentions and actions. These are students who've been accepted, they've applied for aid, they've either indicated a specific college at which they plan to enroll, or they've done that plus taken an additional step like apply for a supplementary scholarship to go to college. In a place like Fort Worth, the definition is a little broader. Students who said they've been accepted and in a general way plan to go to college. So I think that speaks to, just one moment, I'd be happy to take a question. I think that speaks to the range here, but nonetheless, even where we have a fairly strong definition of students having taken actions and having an intention to go to college, you see 1 in 5 students not enrolling anywhere in the fall following, or in the year following high school. In places like Philly, Dallas, Albuquerque, that get upwards of a third. And this kind of half of students not enrolling, I would take that as a high upper bound, given that these were a looser definition. Joseph, please.
Yeah, no, I guess I was saying that this variation is strictly definition based, because one might think that the state context would actually shape some of the summer melt based on distribution of 2 years, 4 years,
of course,
culture.
I think that's very well taken. So I do want to emphasize the contextual nature of this, but again, that's why I would use examples like Boston, Fulton, where these are students, 85 to 90% of students have gone into or are planning to go to a 4-year institution. So they've taken considerable actions and nonetheless run into challenges over the summer that interfere with their enrollment. Any other questions at this stage? Chris was smart. Chris brought lunch. So that will be our direction for future policy seminars, right? So when we think about this pattern of summer melt, one explanation, of course, is that students are making an active decision to postpone or delay their enrollment or forego it entirely in favor of a better alternative, like a well-paying job. And that's certainly possible. I imagine there are some students who we've worked with who are making that decision. Another possibility is that students don't know about the tasks that they need to complete over the summer in order to matriculate. And that's not because institutions aren't sending information. Just about every college that we've looked at has an admitted students website that says, here are the things you need to do in order to enroll. Or they go the extra step of emailing the students, sending them a packet. But the way that they're delivering that information may not align with how first-generation low-income students are used to accessing information. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that students are aware about what they have to do, but they're daunted by all the tasks they have to complete and don't know where to go for help. So just to give you a kind of high-level view of the obstacles or the hurdles that students need to overcome in order to matriculate during the summer, many of these are financial in nature. So what we find is that a substantial share of students who have applied for federal financial aid are flagged by the Department of Education to verify the income or asset information they've provided. It used to be that if you were flagged, you could send documentation to the Department of Education and they would verify you and you would get your award letter. That policy recently changed. Now you have to verify your income and assets with every college to which you've been accepted and on whom you're waiting for an award letter. Again, we find in talking to a lot of students and counselors that students are not aware that they've been flagged for verification. They're not aware when they're supposed to receive their award letter. And so if it's May or June and they haven't got it, there aren't alarm bells going off.
But can you give me a sense of the distribution of students for whom this sort of FAFSA verification process drags into, again, past May 1st, because I think of the institutions that are like UVA and game's over by May 1st,
Right.
In terms of turning in your intent to enroll form, and I would assume that we actually track people,
Yeah.
Are these folks concentrated at a particular set of institutions?
So it's a great point. And I think it's a very good point. I should say that in most of these sites, unlike Sarah and Carolyn's work, which focused on students who were high in the distribution of SAT scores, we are focusing on students across the spectrum who, from primarily urban districts, who are planning to go, have taken steps to and are planning to go to college and universities. Few of them are going to places like the University of Virginia. So you'll have a handful of students who are. But I would say that most of these students are going to moderately or less selective public four-year institutions, some private as well. And in terms of the FAFSA verification, I actually think that's something that we don't know a lot about. I mean, the kind of statistic that's thrown around is the federal government is mandated by law to verify, I think, 30%, at least 30%. What we hear anecdotally, is stressing the anecdote, but in talking to a lot of our partners and counselors, is that verification rates appear to be higher for students. The rates of verification appear to be higher for this demographic, given atypical income, atypical family structures. And what appears to happen is that students have filed their initial FAFSA late, so end of February, early March, late March. The verification, whenever the department gets around to doing it, but that students aren't aware that there's a kind of problem on this until either the end of the school year or beginning of summer. When a counselor says, this is jumping the gun a bit, but when we've had counselors reach out to students and ask about their award letters, students will say, well, I completed the FAFSA early March, but I haven't heard anything since. And that didn't really bring up an alarm bell for the student. Once the counselor dug into it, they realized that the student had been flagged for verification. So that's one indication, that's one type of a set of financial obstacles that can arise over the summer. Once students get award letters, they have to go through they're faced with distinguishing grant aid from loan aid. And this is something that I think the Department of Education has tried hard to make better. There's a now standardized format that the department encourages colleges and universities to use to present information about financial aid. My sense is that about a third of colleges and universities have adopted that form at this point. So there's still plenty of students who are getting aid packages that are often confusing in their content. Vivian?
Does only the student and the student's parents receive information about FAFSA? Does the school counselor receive any kind of information?
That's a great question. So the Department of Education over the past few years has been working on something called the FAFSA Completion Project, which is designed to share with school districts information about where students are in the process of completing the FAFSA, not the contents. So I wouldn't know if you were a student, your income and assets, or how much aid you were awarded, but I would know that you had started the FAFSA, that you would, whether you had completed it, whether you'd been flagged for verification. My sense is there's real variation in how districts have made use of that. Some districts have been very proactive in their use, looking at the data, having counselors reach out to students. I think this may ring true for a lot of people in the room. There are other districts who kind of see the value, but are a bit constrained in their data management or analysis capacities, as well as their counseling outreach capacities to really act on that data. But I'm going to come back to that as a follow-up intervention. So anyways, a whole host of financial challenges that students need to deal with over the summer, as well as procedural challenges. So students need to register for orientation, complete housing forms, either sign up for health insurance, waive insurance. And all of these fairly complicated tasks arise at a time where students typically don't have access to professional guidance or help. They're no longer part of their high school, and counselors typically only work on 9 to 10 month contracts, so they're just often not around. But they've also yet to typically engage with counselors from the college where they're planning to go. And if they're the first in their family to go to college, their parents, I think we often find anecdotally, really want to help them. This is not a disinterest question, but aren't sure how, or are weighing the student going to college against potentially real cost to the family, foregone wage, foregone childcare. So again, complexity may interfere, and then just working with adolescents, another issue that comes up a lot is that students procrastinate. They don't really want to deal with this complicated paperwork. And the challenge of figuring out these bureaucratic and procedural processes, especially when they view it as kind of a last summer to spend with their friends before people go their different ways. So over the last several summers, my colleagues and I have designed and implemented a series of interventions to provide students with information and assistance throughout the summer. And Chris?
So one question, I'm surprised that colleges aren't very actively involved in helping the students overcome these obstacles. I mean, the colleges you're talking about are usually tuition dollar reliant. I don't think have a very strong incentive, so why aren't they doing more?
I don't think I have a good answer for you on that. I think that part of it is I don't know that colleges, though colleges have increasingly developed pretty robust consumer relations management systems, I don't think that colleges have typically viewed this as a large source of loss. There's been a bit of a disconnect where on the high, we're, and others are kind of documenting these MEL rates from the high school or community side. I think colleges make some effort to communicate with students, but if they don't hear back in response to an email or postal letter, they may assume that students are going elsewhere. I've had certainly a number of conversations with colleges and universities, but I haven't seen nor can think of a lot of proactive, personalized engagement by colleges within this sector. I'm not talking about the UVAs and the Harvards. Staff constraints as well. Jim?
So I'm wondering if the summer melt rate is as high as the couple slides ago that you showed, and whether colleges just sort of build that into their admissions process and they over-admit among these groups that are have a much greater incidence of summer melt, and so that process is sort of built in for them rather than needing to remediate it.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert on the admissions calculations or processes, but my sense is that in general, across populations, I think that they do over-admit with the understanding that some students are going to go elsewhere or not go at all. I think at the same time, most colleges and universities with whom I've had conversations about this would say that they actively want to yield more students from underrepresented populations. So those strategies may be a bit misaligned.
I mean, you'd expect to see a pretty sharp line, not necessarily between those that have residential first-year requirements and those that don't, because, I mean, there is a big cost to an institution of either oversubscribing their dorms or having, you know, I would just wonder if that's a boundary on which you see sort of big differences in melt rates.
Yeah, by the type of institution.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, most of our analysis has been with the kind of the high school or community's focus, but it's a worthy point that we should dig a bit more into. Yeah, that's a really nice point.
Yeah, that was my question about it. How much is it, you know, is it a big cost institution, really? Like, say, if particular types of schools, I lose, 2 or 3%, I may not care. It seems like it would vary by time. And are we talking about just 4-year schools when you talk about summer melt, or are you talking about 2-year and 3-year?
Both, and this is a contextual issue. Depending on the location, like in Boston and Fulham, I mentioned you had 85% of students go into 4 years, 15% to 2 years. In Fort Worth, it's not quite flipped, but there you have the majority of students planning to go to 2 years. And you'll see that in a couple of the sites.
So that's my question about context. So if it's mostly students not showing up to 2-year schools, those schools just kind of live with that, while DBA would care if somebody doesn't show up. So I think that would be a really important question.
Yeah, no, I think the supply side is important to look at. So, so we've designed and evaluated through randomized trials, as Sarah said earlier, several interventions aimed at providing students with additional information and help through the summer months. In several sites, we've had school counselors or community-based financial aid advisors reach out to students and offer 2 to 3 hours of additional help with financial aid packages, these procedural tasks, social emotional barriers to enrollment. In a separate set of trials, we had peer mentors who were in college and succeeding, who had graduated from the same communities and often from the same high schools, reach out to these students as a kind of frontline outreach of support, perspective, encouragement to persevere through the summer, and also as a way of facilitating connections between students and counselors. And then where I'm going to spend most of my time, remaining time, is in a third set of trials, we've sent students personalized text message reminders of tasks they had to complete in order to matriculate. So this has been 13 urban districts over 4 years with about 25,000 students participating in these experiments across sites and interventions. So as I said, I'm going to focus mainly on the text messages. And so given the potential behavioral obstacles that may be preventing students from following through on their intentions to matriculate, we designed a series of 10 text message reminders that consolidated and simplified information about tasks that students had to complete at their intended college. So here's a couple examples for you. This is around orientation registration, and you can see this is highly personalized to not only the student, but also their institution. So it asks Alex whether she's signed up for the UMass Boston orientation, tells her when the last date was, includes a web link to enable her to complete the orientation registration process right from her phone, assuming she has a smartphone, which increasingly most teenagers do. Yeah, nothing.
You track whether or not they click on the
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And it also invites the student to reply back if they need help from a counselor. So I would say about 60%, 70% of the texts were discrete tasks in nature. Have you done this? Here's the date by when you need to do it. Here's a web link that will allow you to. The balance were more open-ended, so still personalized to the student, but encouraging the student and prompting the student to think about other important parts of the matriculation process they might need to attend to, like completing the FAFSA if they haven't already, the federal financial aid application, getting help with their award letter, investigating sources of more aid. Again, here inviting them to meet, this is Dallas Independent School District Council. And so when we were setting these up, I realized this more, in all honesty, in retrospect than at the time. We were just maybe a little bit prescient in our thinking. But I think these text messages really operate, as I think of, kind of like a behavioral multivitamin in the potential channels through which they impacted students' outcomes. One thing that they may have done is just reduce complexity by consolidating and simplifying information about tasks that students have to complete. Two, they reduce hassles by allowing students to follow a web link, complete a task in the moment, or write back and get help from a counselor rather than have to pick up the phone or go to the school. They combat procrastination by prompting students to deal with the task in the moment before their attention is diverted elsewhere. The simple act of sending students a series of information about college may prime them to think about and focus on themselves as college-ready material rather than, and they work against some of the doubts they may be having over the summer about their readiness for college. And as I mentioned earlier, getting help is as simple as replying to a text message, which I think for adolescents is probably a much smaller relational hurdle to overcome than calling up a counselor. Our initial round of text messaging interventions were done in 2 sites. One in 3 cities in Massachusetts, working in partnership with UAspire, a college access organization. UAspire staffs financial aid professionals in all of the public high schools in all of these cities. So we had reach to all seniors, but we went through this intermediary, not through the districts themselves. And in Dallas, we worked with the Dallas Independent Schools. This came up in a talk the other day. So independent does not mean private. Texas and in some other sites refer to their public school districts as independent school districts. So this is the primary public school district in Dallas, Texas. In terms of the intervention design, I've already mentioned much of this, but to just give you a little more sense, each of the sites worked with us to gather students' cell phone numbers, names obviously, where they were planning to go to college via exit survey administered a few weeks before the end of the year. We then randomly assigned students to receive these 10 text messages that I described earlier. These details I've already mentioned, I think, for the most part. One thing to emphasize is that where possible, and I'll show you how much we were able to do this, we also messaged parents with essentially the same information, just slightly reframed. So instead of saying, "Dear Dan, the student," it would say, "Hi Jim, your child, so-and-so, Dan, needs to register," great thought, isn't it? You don't know what you're getting into, right? But oriented to the parents, so we make sure the parents were informed. And in Dallas, given the high concentration of parents who are English language learners, we provide the option to get the messages in Spanish. This just provides you some sample characteristics from each of the sites. What you can see is that in both sites, the students, just one moment, Scott, I'd be happy to go to the question. Majority students of color, majority low or lower income, proxied for by whether they qualify for free or reduced price lunch. And one thing with any kind of text messaging or really communication intervention, the intervention is only as good as your ability to get the contact information that you're looking for. And so you can see in Dallas, slightly over half of students and just under half, slightly half of students who complete the survey voluntarily provide their cell phone number. We obviously need it voluntarily. We weren't going to, buy the numbers and then just message people. And slightly less than half of the students provide numbers for their parents. In the Massachusetts sites, closer to 3/4 of students provided their number, but many fewer did for their parents. I think this higher rate here speaks to the fact that we were working with this college access organization that probably, I think it's safe to say, had closer relationships with students than the district did on average. And there's about 2,500 students who we assigned to receive the text messages. I'm not showing it here just in the interest of time, but the students that we randomly assigned to get the text and not are very well balanced on a host of student level characteristics. Scott.
Yeah, I was just wondering what happens when the student actually replies and asks for help. How does that then proceed?
That's a great question. So in the results that I'll show now, think about it as like 1980s Atari console. So a student writes back. There's some people here, besides professors, who were born and alive in the 1980s, right? This is when I start to feel quite old. So when a student wrote back, it would show up on an online portal, that totally anonymized, but it would show up on an online portal that we could observe. And then there was one of 4 buttons to press. Once help meant, it was literally like pressing the button. That would send an automatic message to the student saying, okay, a counselor will be in touch. And it would send an automatic email to Sarah, the counselor, saying, Scott has reached out for help, here's his number. If a student said, stop messaging me, we would have a stop button that would tell them, okay, we won't send you any more messages. And then if there was a credibility button, where if a student said, who's this, or like, why are you messaging me? We'd have followed up, said, this is a project from the Dallas Independent Schools. If you want to confirm this is legitimate, here's a number you can call. Now, in the intervention we did last summer, and I should point out, these are all automated text. I was not sitting there on my iPhone sending 10 messages to 2,500 students. We worked with a text messaging platform that could automate this. Now, they've since developed a much more interactive platform. So if a student writes back, a counselor logs on to what to the counselor looks like web-based email. But they can view the message thread that they have the students write back. That gets then sent to the student as a text. So it's kind of optimizing communication strategies on both sides. Counselors are much more comfortable and prefer email to using their own personal cell. But students, we have found email is not very successful at reaching students, whereas text is. Code.
So thinking about the scalability, so these are counselors that are already in the school district or with this partner, this college access partner, they're sort of.
So it's there? In this intervention, yes. In Dallas, we had grant funds to hire some counselors to work over the summer, and similarly in this organization. We've since expanded the types of people who are responding to the help, but generally it's school counselors, it's either school or community-based staff, and now in some cases college staff. I'll talk about that a bit earlier. But people who have experience and some level of training to deal with these issues. Yes, please.
Do you know that students were putting down their accurate phone numbers in the majority of cases?
So that's another great question. At the time, we were able to verify whether numbers were valid cell numbers. We didn't know, and I'm not sure there's still a way to do this with SMS, to know whether the message was actually delivered and read. There are types of messaging. If I have an iPhone and you have one, it's not going through SMS, right? So you get a message if you've sent me and it's delivered. We didn't have that level of information, but 97% of the numbers were working valid cell numbers. So a person might have written down their neighbor's cell number, but someone was getting these messages. Please, sorry, Nancy.
Okay, do you have information on first generation and college status?
We don't. So not in these sites. I think that our partners would say that the considerable majority of these students are the first in their family to go to college, but I don't have an accurate report. So this gives you a sense of both the response rates as well as the number that have actually met with a counselor. And I think this is going to be important when we think about mechanisms driving the results I'm about to show you. So you can see across sites, at least a third of students, and in Springfield, upwards of 50% of students responded to the text, at least one text message. Thank you. And these are, it's worth pointing out, these are response rates out of the entire sample of students that were assigned to the messages. So remember in Dallas, we did the assignment before, we wound up having to do the assignment before we knew whether students had provided cell phone numbers or not. So that, whether they did or not, was balanced across groups. But this is 31% of the overall treatment group responding, despite the fact that we only had cell phone numbers for 56%. So you can scale this up, and it suggests the effective response rate is quite a bit higher. The actual meeting rates are considerably lower. So in Dallas, only 6% of students who were assigned to receive the messages actually met with a counselor. In the Aspire sites, it's higher, but it's not. There's still a considerable gap, 20 to 30%. Yeah, Denise.
Do you know if part of that difference might be due to distance to meeting with a counselor or public transportation?
I think there are probably a lot of factors. I think both of those are probably likely. I think in some ways, what we didn't factor in enough going into this was that students expected a response to the text pretty quick. And counselors, most of the counselors we worked with, I would say median age was maybe 45 to 50. I don't think, as a group, they quite got the extent to which students were expecting quick responses. So as we've looked through the responses, one thing we've heard is, well, if you're going to text me, write back within a day, write back within a couple days. So I think part of it was a response speed issue as well, that students got a little frustrated when they didn't do that. Yeah, Catherine?
What were some of the differences in the types of texts that students responded and wanted?
That's a really good question. I don't know that we're working on a paper now that actively is looking really at the details of the student responses. So I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but I should be able to tell you in a month or so.
So did you collect the data on procrastination from the person responding to the text? So you know, for example, how long they took between they got the text and respond or not?
Yes, and that's what's going into the current paper over.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to keep going, just in the interest of time, but give you a sample of the types of messages. Some were just kind of, about a third of them were just in some ways grateful. Not always solicited. Sometimes it was, okay, thanks, this is helpful, or thanks. There were also about a third that were kind of clearly a response that indicated the message provides students with some kind of useful information that potentially led them to take some kind of action. So here's just a few. And then about a third were either something on, well, actually, a third or so were just saying I'm all set, or thanks, but I'm not in a good case, that they felt like they were on track. Fewer than 4% of students at any point opted out of receiving messages. Anyone who did, we canceled it immediately. But I take that as an indication that students didn't feel that these messages were burdensome or annoying. For about a third, they might not have been new information, but no one, or not no one, but very few said they didn't want to get. Yeah, please.
When opting out, was there a link that they would click in the message, or would it be?
They could write back anything. You're pissing me off, stop messaging me, and we would, or just stop, or, anything that indicated, we were very conservative. So if someone indicated any potential displeasure with getting the message, we stopped them immediately. That was part of this Atari stop button. This gives you a sense of the results. So the text messages, the variations really at the site level. So the messages appear to, the site and student level. So the messages appear to be quite effective for students in sites or certain subgroups that had little access to college planning supports. So Lawrence and Springfield, where there are very few school or community-based college access planning supports during the school year, during the summer, you could see that sending these 10 text messages increased enrollment by about 7 percentage points. 4 percentage point increase among Dallas free reduced lunch students, that's 80% of the district. And also among students who didn't appear to be as far along in their college planning. So substantial increases for students who had said, I am planning to go to college, I just don't know where yet. And for students, this is a rougher proxy, but students who had not interacted as much with this financial aid advising organization during the year, and that these students may have benefited from additional information. By contrast, we find no effect of the text messages in Boston, where there's a very high concentration of both school and community-based college planning supports, both during the school year and into the summer. So our interpretation, and this is from our first text messaging intervention, we're still analyzing the results from last summer. But one initial interpretation is that the messages appear to be useful in sites where students aren't getting quality information or don't have quality access to assistance. They are making less of a contribution in places where students have a lot of information and access to help. That's one potential interpretation. Yeah,
Did you
just
look at variation by 2-year versus 4-year intention? Because you think that with the 2-year it would make more of a difference.
Yeah, we actually don't. So we don't focus. We don't report the differences in our paper, and I think the reason is that when we kind of look within site by 2-year, 4-year, we don't see a lot of differences. I can double check. Yeah. So there's a few potential mechanisms by which these messages may have impacted students' outcomes that we talked about earlier. One may be that the messages are increasing students' access to information. So, as I said, the biggest impacts were in sites or for students subgroups who plausibly had the least access to information. But to Ignacio's question earlier, and this is in an appendix in the paper that I think Leslie is available on the site, the click-through rates are pretty modest. Now, as you probably know with click-through data, we don't know whether it's you clicking 50 times or each person, each of 50 people each clicking once.
You could do that with a little program for next time. So you can create individual short links.
Yes.
So you will be creating 1,000 short links, and in that way, like, you are receiving a specific link. So in
That's
that
a
way,
great idea. So I'll follow up with you on that. I hadn't thought about that. And we did not do that here. So everyone followed it. We were able to see the analytics for each link, but everyone followed the same link. But the rates are modest. So in Dallas, where we were sending messages, effectively sending messages to about 700 students, the click-through rates per link were 100, 150. So not minuscule, but it's not 50% of people following. Another possibility that we talked about earlier is that the messages might effectively connect students to counselors. There's certainly not much support for this in Dallas, where fewer than 6% of students met with counselors. In U Aspire sites, the meeting rates are higher, but they're quite consistent across the sites. And U Aspire is an organization that has very strong advising quality and coherence. So it's a little unclear why there would be these big impacts in Lawrence and Springfield, not in Boston, if the primary mechanism of the messages was that they just provide an effective connection with the counselors. Rebecca.
So Dallas counselors have a really bad reputation. People don't go to them, and if they do go to them, they're known for not being helpful. Do you know if they spoke Spanish too? Because that's also a problem.
So these were not, I think if I remember right, there were 9 or 10 counselors that we had retained, and these were, I mean, we don't actually know this, we were depending on our partner, but these were like the best of the best in terms of engaging with students and being bilingual. I think 80% of them or so were bilingual. So as much as one can influence any kind of recruitment in an intervention partner, we try to be as thoughtful as possible about working with our site partner to bring in counselors to whom students will be responsive. But again, I think that it's certainly a potential explanation. Yeah, please.
For the counselor interaction, when were there meetings with the counselors versus just texts with the counselors, and which one are you counting as?
So we're not, if a student just had text exchange with a counselor, or even just kind of phone exchange, we're not counting that. This is, I'm sitting down with you to do something meeting.
Okay, and how much information was given via text or email that could have, maybe, that could have pushed the student over the edge and maybe they got the information they needed?
Well, so I think that's certainly possible. The messages both provided institution-specific content. They provided prompts. They provided links where the students could get more information. You know, some of these students, if they didn't have a smartphone, they had just written the link into a computer or called the college themselves or gone to the college website. So we only are able to observe a partial set of all of the universe of possible interactions the students had with the college or with their counselor. Chris.
So when you talk about like low click-through interaction rates, I guess I'm wondering how you decide, how you know they're low. And the reason I'm asking that is, I think you had like a 4 percentage point difference between the treatment and control groups in a lot of these. And so, you know, if those 4% are the ones who are clicking through, it actually could be a high rate.
It's a fair point. No, I don't have a kind of clear benchmark for how I'm describing these as modest or high. And you're certainly right that these, you know, the students who enrolled could be driven entirely here. So it's a fair point that we don't have a kind of clear link between mechanism and outcome, but just kind of exploring possibilities. We had done some surveying. We weren't able to do this in Texas, unfortunately, but with the U Aspire sites, where we asked students to respond if they felt each statement was true. And you can see the students did not have to choose just one. There were multiple choices. They could list multiple things. Most students felt that the messages got them to complete a task they had to get done, informed them about something they hadn't realized they needed to do, or manage their time better. So, you know, this is, I would take these survey responses as suggestive as best, but I think it, again, indicates that there was some combination of providing students with information, prompting them to deal with a task that the students may have found useful. This, I intend, is a real rough back of the envelope comparison on cost effectiveness. And the reason there is that the other interventions I described have different intervention styles. They are working with different samples in different contexts. So all of that is important background. But just to kind of give you a sense, our text messaging intervention costs $7 per student. That's inclusive of the cost of retaining counselors to support students in the summer. Just the messaging was about $2 per student, and generated for certain groups of students up to a 7 percentage point increase in college going. Compared to our prior counseling outreach, that was more like $150 per student for similar impact in different settings, different contexts. Two other comparable interventions in terms of the populations they were serving and in terms of the, I suppose, intensity of their outreach, or the FAFSA completion intervention I described earlier. Slightly more expensive, a larger increase, and importantly for the FAFSA intervention, a demonstrated effect on persistence. And so that's certainly something we're going to need to look at with the testing intervention. And then peer mentor intervention, that was considerably more expensive, but again, large effect. So I put this up here just to give you some context for thinking about the potential cost effectiveness of this relative to other strategies. I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk to you about a follow-up text intervention that I've just analyzed the results for. So view this as quite preliminary. The intervention I just described focused on college access, but there's a lot of reason why we'd also like to be investing effort to improve college access, college success, the number of students who actually graduate. Even conditional on academic achievement, work my advisor has done shows that students from low-income families persist at lower rates. Other research has shown that students from lower income quartiles are much less likely to complete a 4-year degree by their mid-20s than students from higher income quartiles. And there may be behavior obstacles that contribute to these inequalities. So I mentioned choice overload earlier in terms of courses or majors. Students are spread thin academically and socially in college, and so they may not be as attentive to complete important tasks. Students may really question whether they belong in college and whether college is a place where they can be successful, depending on the institution. There's been a lot of really interesting work on social belonging in college by social psychologists at Stanford and other places. And again, students have limited access to professional guidance or support. School counseling is limited in high schools, and it's even more limited in the kind of moderately or less selective public and higher education institutions in the country. One thing that we might want to focus on in terms of improving persistence and hopefully success is FAFSA renewal. So there's been a lot of attention, I mentioned earlier, to the potential complexities of initial FAFSA submission, how that might prevent college-ready students from going to college. Despite the fact that students have to renew their FAFSA every year to maintain their rating, there's been considerably less attention either on the trends and patterns in FAFSA renewal or on interventions to help students and remind students to complete, to refile their federal aid applications. Again, the channels through which the Department of Education or colleges remind students about FAFSA refiling may be ineffective. Work that Kelly Bird is really spearheading, I think really important work, shows that anywhere from 10 to 20% of college freshmen Pell Grant recipients who are in good academic standing freshman year, meaning they've got a 3.0 GPA or higher, aren't refiling their FAFSA. And that there may be, again, be behavioral reasons. If you think about the average freshman who's dealing with all kinds of academic and social and maybe psychological considerations or challenges or just priorities freshman year, it's probably fairly likely that they're going to procrastinate on completing something burdensome like a federal financial aid application. And as a result, may either miss key deadlines to qualify for additional aid or may just not file at all. So we sent another series of text message reminders to college freshmen with important reminders about renewing their FAFSA. This was again in partnership with You Aspire, and one of the messages invited students to attend a FAFSA renewal party on their campus or at a You Aspire site. The idea being that they could get in-person help to complete the FAFSA, but also to kind of create a positive social norm and a chance to connect with friends that they might have had from the college or high school. They were offered individual help with FAFSA completion. Either they could call the office and set up an appointment. It gave resources for filing the taxes for free, which you have to do in order to apply for federal aid. and offered help interpreting their award letters once students had received them. This was very much a pilot intervention. We did this with 733 college freshmen who had worked with Aspire at high school. They had received text, all the students had received text message or peer mentor outreach the summer before freshman year. So this is a subset of students who are conditioned on some level to receiving additional outreach from Aspire prior or after they finished high school. I'm just going to go through this a little more quickly. Predominantly low-income students of color, about 3/4 are at four-year institutions, a quarter at community colleges. We randomly assigned half of them to get the text, and again, well-balanced across treatment groups. This shows you the overall sophomore year persistence impacts. Our data limitations in this intervention are fairly extensive. We at least observe whether they're in college the next year. We don't observe whether they actually renew the FAFSA. And we don't observe much about really anything about their college performance, classes they take, majors they pursue. What you can see is most students overall are persisting in college. Slightly less, but imprecise difference in terms of persisting at a four-year, but a large increase in the probability of persisting at a two-year institution. So that logically suggests we should look at this by whether students had enrolled in a four-year or two-year institution. And here we start to see some really interesting results that I'm just in the process of digging into. So of students who start at four-year institutions, these are the first three columns, again, the vast majority are persisting. Students who get the text are less likely, this is just marginally significant at that 0.10 level, but are actually less likely to return for sophomore year, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. If we shift over to students who start at two-year institutions, a 15 percentage point increase in persisting, with most of that driven by students returning to a two-year institution. And most of that being at the institution they had originally enrolled in. So again, preliminary results, still digging into it. But to give you a sense, at least of some initial reasoning why these texts might be effective. On the positive side for the two-year starters, we think that the text may be providing information or prompts about FAFSA renewal that students are just not getting otherwise at a community college. So Judy Scott Clay at Teachers College has done great work as a paper called The Shapeless River that talks about how difficult it is for community college students to navigate course selections and the bureaucracy of institutions that often have very little advising resources. These are students who spend limited time on campus because they're commuting. The advising resources are spread very thin, so they may just not be getting information about renewal. The text message may make a big difference there, or a series of messages. In terms of the four-year starters, this is driven primarily by two groups of students. First are students who have estimated family contribution, or EFC, is what the federal government reports is your ability to pay for college. It determines whether you get federal and state aid-based grant aid. So students who had an EFC outside the Pell awardable range, meaning they would not have gotten a Pell grant, were the ones who were largely driving this negative effect. They have been more dependent on loan aid the freshman year. Students who enrolled at a college outside their city, meaning outside Boston or Springfield, were the other group that were largely driving this negative effect for four-year starters. And again, these are students who were paying out of their own money, potentially out of their aid to live on campus. So the possibility that we're exploring now is that for the four-year starters, that what the text did was cause students to reconsider the affordability of their college plans. We are in the process of investigating this decision-making through some actual surveys. So I put these up as kind of, speculative interpretation, but the patterns I think are really interesting. Yeah, yes.
Sorry, you know only they persisted at the school they were at? Or
We know whether they went anywhere.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. So just to wrap up in the time we have, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions. I and my colleagues are really interested in taking these strategies of personalized information and the offer of assistance and extending it both early and later in students' college trajectories. And so earlier in high school, we'd like to build on, again, Sarah and Carolyn's great work, encourage students to seek out help with college choice, help students identify colleges and universities that are well matched to their abilities and interests. Someone asked earlier about the FAFSA verification and the data. Vivian, I think you were asking, or someone was asking about what districts know. Districts have the ability to know quite a bit. They're underutilizing information. And so in Texas, we're not doing this with Dallas, but my colleague and I are capitalizing on a platform that has not only very up-to-date student level information of initial submission, completion, verification, but also has collected student cell phone numbers at the point of applying for college. And so we're going to be delivering messages that inform students of their process in the FAFSA through completion and verification. Once in college, we can encourage students to make use of academic and social supports, provide guidance about course and major selection. One thing I'm just starting to work on with Kelly and Andrew Barr, another income PhD student, is a project focused on providing students who are leaving community college with more guidance about their loan repayment options and strategies to kind of manage the loan debt that they've acquired. And I think there are also lots of other contexts in which this type of work could be effective. So all of the work I showed you today was in a rural setting, in an urban setting. I'm doing work now with the West Virginia Higher Ed Policy Commission to look at the impact of these texting strategies on students in rural settings for whom this kind of information may be that much more important, given that they're geographically disparate and have less access to college advising resources. At this point, as I said, we've worked primarily through schools and community-based organizations and have been primarily student-facing in our work. I think there's a lot of work, a lot of potential to get better information to parents or other social influences in students' lives to help them guide their students more effectively. So whether that's working with a large employer or an organization that has connection to parents or to provide this kind of information to non-traditional students, that's some work that Sarah and I are doing now. And then finally, there's probably a lot of room to do additional capacity building and prompts for counselors to help support students in the process. So we're doing some work in that area. I think the take home that I have from this is that I think there's a pretty high ceiling to creatively leverage technology that students are engaging with every day to deliver personalized information and make it easy for students to access professional assistance when they need it, as a scalable strategy to address longstanding inequalities in college access and success. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much. If you want to read the papers that underlie this work, you can see my website. Please email me with questions, and I'm happy to take a few more minutes until 1:45 to answer any additional questions. Good.
So I hadn't ever really thought about this sort of perverse effects story that you told in the second study, and so I'm wondering, are you concerned at all that your average treatment effects in the other study might also be masking some countervailing effects that maybe just sort of information increases cognitive load, and for some of these kids that actually makes them think this is too much and maybe I shouldn't pursue college?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I would say that I think is more broadly about kind of any kind of intervention where we're adding additional information. We're proactively bringing additional information that's potential to operate through unintended mechanisms. I think we try to be as thoughtful as possible in designing the text messages, in sending them in consolidated bursts, framing things as wherever possible. The ones I showed you, you can see were framed almost entirely as questions, so to not lead students to think they hadn't done something that they had, or vice versa. But and I'm not sure I see this. Given that this negative effect is driven by students, by two groups of students who are attending, and I should have mentioned, less selective residential colleges outside their city, and by students who are outside the Palo-Wartable range, it's obviously for the students themselves to decide whether continuing at colleges are good or a bad thing, but from a kind of debt accumulation point of view, at institutions that have pretty low graduation rates, I'm not sure that in the long run, which we will certainly follow, we'd love to observe things like labor market earnings down the road, right? I'm not convinced this is necessarily a negative outcome for the student. To leave an institution where they're potentially taking quite a bit of debt and have a questionable probability of graduating. That's an open question. I intend to be agnostic about it, but I think it's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just points to maybe possible exploration of greater heterogeneity in the other work too. Does this differ by sort of your parents' level of education?
Yeah,
other things that might be important about thinking about information on its own, information plus the assistance.
Sure. So in the summer 2012 work, we've dug into quite considerably. there's not with all the subgroup analysis that we did, there's no group that we came across for whom the students were negatively impacted by the text. It's certainly possible there are things that there are negative effects on dimensions that we can't observe, but not that we found. There are some, like I said, in Boston where there's no effect, but no group that appears to have been negatively impacted. Jim, Dan. Okay, Jim and Dad and son.
So I just want to be the first in line for the business you start to send me text messages so I can get my work done. but it sort of prompts the question of wanting to better understand the mechanisms, and you sort of alluded to this, but I think, so for example, you could imagine sending text messages that develop a set of behaviors in kids that then persist long afterwards, and you basically develop a set of skills in them, as opposed to why I need text messages, because I'll never get those skills, and you just need to keep prompting me throughout the rest of my life. So I wanted to sort of push you back on the mechanisms part of this, and I can understand the mechanisms might differ depending upon groups, but wanting to understand that better might provide us a better sense of what the short and long-term implications of this are.
Yeah, no, it's a great and a very important question. I mean, I didn't get to speak to this as much. I'd like to know how much it's just the information in the prompt versus the connection to the counselor. I'd like to know how much it's messaging students and parents versus just students versus just parents. How much of it's the actual text message versus a different approach to delivery, right? There's a lot that is wrapped up in here that I am drawing some broad interpretations from, but that I think warrant additional inquiry. And we did some very basic qualitative work. It'd be nice to know whether students are changing the way they approach work or manage their own time. So I hope that those are things that we will dig into more going forward, because I agree they're really important questions. Son?
I just wanted to, I was thinking about the Boston, and it seems like with the Boston in your initial study, what was surprising to me was I thought maybe if it was just they had a better system that you'd see the control group being high, where it seems like the control group was about what other control groups were, and it just the treatment group wasn't higher. And so
I think the Boston control group, so one, it's probably different types of enrollment as well. So it's substantially, the Boston control group is where the Lawrence and Springfield treatment groups are.
Oh.
And then in Dallas, I think the Dallas pattern is more a 2-year enrollment. It is more 2-year enrollment, so that may be some difference as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking, so it seems like, because wasn't Boston 60%? Isn't that?
60%.
For both groups?
70%.
Oh, no, I'm 70%. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I mean, the other thing I would say is that one of the things that's encouraging, and I don't have these results to share, obviously with any kind of first intervention, the question we want to ask is, does this replicate in other settings and other times? So we've now done experimental replications in 8 other settings for this past summer. We're still analyzing the results, but we see similar magnitude impacts in texting. There have also been sites that, not experimentally, but have adopted this model this past summer in different parts of the country to support students. And by their own descriptive analysis or anecdote, they feel like it's also helping provide students with useful information, that students are very engaging in the information. So again, like with any intervention, I think we should continue to try and replicate and explore mechanisms. I do think that this approach of delivering, again, personalized information through channels that reach students and helping them connect to assistance is a strategy that we can adopt as one of many to continue to address these inequalities. I unfortunately think I need to run. Again, I'm happy to follow up with anyone, but thank you all very much for being here.